The gold-engraved invitation arrived on a Tuesday morning. Diana Mercer turned it over in her hands 3 times before she believed it was real. The paper was thick, expensive, the kind that cost more per sheet than she spent on groceries in a week. Her name was printed in perfect calligraphy at the center. Mrs. Diana Mercer. Except she wasn't Mrs. Mercer anymore. She hadn't been for 14 months. The man who had mailed it knew that. He knew it better than anyone. Inside the envelope, beneath the golden lettering that announced the wedding of Marcus Dillon Mercer to one Miss Camille Ashford, was a handwritten note. No signature. Just 4 words. I thought of you. Diana set the card on her kitchen table. Around her, the apartment was quiet in the way that only happens just before something breaks, that suspended, dangerous kind of silence. She had twin daughters sleeping in the next room. 3-year-olds who didn't yet know their father's name. 3-year-olds who had never once been held by the man who mailed that gold envelope. She pressed her fingertips flat against the table and stared at the invitation for a long time. Here is what you need to understand about that moment. It wasn't the insult that stopped her breathing. It wasn't the cruelty hidden in those 4 careless words. It was the realization that Marcus had sent this on purpose. He had tracked down her new address. He had paid someone to write her name in beautiful letters. He had stamped it and dropped it into a mailbox with the full expectation that she would walk through his wedding doors looking exactly like what he believed she had become. Broken. Small. Forgotten. He wanted her there so he could look at her and feel tall. What Marcus Dillon Mercer did not know, what no one in that glittering world of his knew, was that in the 14 months since he had thrown Diana out of their home with nothing but a suitcase and a shattered heart, something had happened. Something quiet and enormous and unstoppable. A transformation that doesn't make headlines when it begins, only when it finally lands. And it was about to land. Diana picked up the invitation, walked to her window, and looked out at the city below. Then she did something no one would have predicted. She smiled. Not the smile of a woman who had given up. Not the polite, hollow smile she had worn all through her marriage when things turned dark and she kept telling herself it would get better. This was something different. Harder. Sharper. The smile of a woman who had been to the very bottom of herself and found out what she was made of down there. She set the invitation back on the table. She opened her phone. She made a call. And what happened next, no one was prepared for. But to understand what walked through those wedding doors on a bright Saturday afternoon in Beverly Hills, you have to understand who Diana Mercer was before Marcus ever found her. You have to understand what he took from her. And you have to understand what she built, quietly, carefully, brick by brick, in the ruins he left behind. Because this story isn't really about a wedding. It isn't about revenge, or billionaires, or white gloves and champagne glasses. It is about what happens when a man mistakes silence for weakness. When he looks at a woman who is surviving and decides she is finished. When he mails a golden envelope to the wrong woman. Marcus Mercer thought he was sending an invitation. He was actually signing a confession. Before we continue, to our new viewers joining today, subscribe and say hello in the comments. I enjoy recognizing and welcoming members of our growing family. Today's warm shout-out goes to Patricia Broussard from the United States, Wanda from South Africa, and Juliet from Jamaica. Thank you for being part of our family. Subscribe now and comment below so I can welcome you too. So who is Diana Mercer? That question depends entirely on when you ask it. Ask Marcus Mercer, and he will give you his version. The version where she was a quiet girl from a small town who got lucky marrying into his orbit. Where she was soft and unambitious and ultimately an obstacle to the life he deserved. He would tell you she was never going to keep up. That the divorce was mercy, his mercy, even if she didn't see it that way at the time. But here is the first thing you need to know. That version is a lie a man tells himself so he can sleep at night. Ask the women at the downtown shelter where Diana volunteered every Saturday for 2 years before her marriage fell apart. They will tell you something different. They will tell you she was the one who remembered every name, who showed up when no one else did, who sat with women in the dark and said I believe you and meant it with her whole chest. Ask her college professor, Dr. Ellen Morse, who still keeps Diana's thesis, a 40-page analysis of financial exploitation within domestic partnerships, framed on her office wall. She will tell you Diana Mercer was the sharpest student she had seen in 20 years of teaching. Not flashy sharp. Deep sharp. The kind of mind that goes very quiet and then solves the thing everyone else has already given up on. Ask the 3 investors who quietly left Marcus's wedding before the ceremony even began. They will tell you that the woman who walked through those doors in a champagne dress was the most expensive mistake Marcus Mercer ever made. Not because of what she said. Because of what she had already done before she arrived. But that's getting ahead of things. That's the ending. And you can't understand the ending without the beginning. So why did a woman like that, brilliant, principled, careful, marry Marcus Mercer in the first place? That is the question, isn't it? And the answer is simple enough to be heartbreaking. She loved him. She loved him before he became the man the money made him. She loved him when he was still reaching for something and had not yet decided that reaching meant stepping on whoever stood closest. She loved the version of him that was still capable of being changed by the love of a good woman. She was wrong about that version. But she was not wrong to love it. There is a difference. And she had also, and this matters enormously for what comes later, she had also never stopped being herself. Even through 4 years of a marriage that slowly chipped away at her confidence, that told her she was simultaneously too much and not enough, that isolated her from her own ambitions so quietly she barely noticed it happening, she kept one small, stubborn, essential part of herself intact. Locked away. Quiet. Patient. Waiting. The second thing you need to know is this. Diana had twins. Ava and Grace Mercer, born 7 weeks after Marcus filed for divorce. 2 little girls with their mother's eyes and their father's jawline, which Marcus found inconvenient enough to pretend they didn't exist. He had never filed for custody. Had never sent a card, a call, a single dollar. 3 years of their lives, and he had contributed nothing except the biological fact of them and the name he hadn't even let them keep. Which meant that when Diana received that gold envelope, she read the subtext with perfect, forensic clarity. He thought she was still drowning. He thought 14 months of single motherhood, of starting from nothing, of working herself back from the bottom up, he thought all of that had finished her. He thought she would walk into his wedding looking like everything he had ever told her she was. He had not been paying attention. That was his first mistake. The third thing you need to know, and I want you to hold this, is that Diana did not walk into that wedding alone. But we will get to that. Because first you need to understand the year that built her. The year that should have broken her and didn't. The year that Marcus Mercer will spend the rest of his life wishing he had paid attention to, because while he was ordering custom tuxedos and tasting wedding cakes, the woman he threw out was becoming someone he had never prepared to face. Where does rock bottom end and resurrection begin? For Diana, it began on a Wednesday night in a parking lot, in the dark, with a card that declined twice and a stranger who handed her a $20 bill. The day Marcus filed for divorce, Diana was 7 months pregnant. She found out the way people find out about betrayals they weren't looking for, by accident, at the wrong moment. A document left open on a shared computer. A lawyer's name and a case number and her own name typed in the opposing party field. She sat in front of that screen for 4 minutes and 30 seconds. She counted later, because she had nothing else to do with the feeling. She couldn't scream, the housekeeper was downstairs. She couldn't cry, she wasn't sure she'd be able to stop. She closed the laptop. Walked to the kitchen. Made herself a cup of tea. And while the kettle boiled, something in her chest quietly and permanently went to steel. But here is what you didn't know about Diana's life before that moment, because Marcus certainly didn't know it, or didn't bother to know it, which is worse. He had never been truly curious about who she was beneath the part that was useful to him. He had never asked about the girl she used to be before he found her. And that girl was the thing he had fatally underestimated. Diana grew up in Beaumont, Texas. Population 30,000. Her mother, Carol, worked the morning shift at a diner and the evening shift at a motel reception desk, and in between those 2 shifts she raised Diana and her younger brother Theo without a single complaint loud enough for the children to hear. The complaints happened in private. In bathroom mirrors. In the front seat of the car on the way home when she thought the kids were asleep in the back seat. Diana heard them anyway. She was 10 years old the first time she understood that her mother was quietly holding a world together that could fall apart at any moment, and she filed that understanding away the way you file the most important things, not consciously, but permanently. That image, her mother's quiet, undefeated strength, was the first thing Diana was made of. The second thing was books. Diana read everything. She read while waiting for the school bus in the dark at 6:30 in the morning. He was at a conference in Houston. She was presenting research on wage gap economics for a panel discussion, her professor had submitted her work without telling her, and she had found out with 2 days' notice and stayed up for 47 hours preparing. She was 26 and brilliant and nervous and dressed in a blazer she had bought secondhand and pressed the night before. He was in the audience in a blue suit and a watch that cost more than her annual scholarship stipend. He came to find her afterward. He was charming in the way that only men who have practiced it for years can be, interested in exactly the right things, asking exactly the right questions, laughing at exactly the right moments. He made her feel seen in a room full of people who had not quite seen her. Later, she would understand that he wasn't seeing her. He was auditing her. Assessing what she was worth to the image he was building of himself. A brilliant, quietly elegant woman from modest beginnings who had earned her way, that was an asset. That was the kind of origin story that made rich men look good at dinner parties. He filed her into his plans the way he filed everything, efficiently, without sentiment. But at 26, standing in the bright lights of a Houston conference hall with the applause still fading, Diana felt what she felt. And what she felt was real, even if what he offered was not. Love at 26 can make a blueprint look like a fairy tale. She would not be the last woman to make that mistake. She would not be punished for it forever. They married 18 months later. Her mother wore a blue dress to the ceremony and said nothing about the prenuptial agreement Marcus's attorney had slid across a table 6 weeks before the wedding. Nothing out loud. But at the signing, Diana looked across the table and saw her mother's hands resting in her lap. Still. Folded. Tight. She signed the agreement anyway. She told herself it was trust. Later she understood it was hope, and hope is not always wrong to have, even when it is disappointed. The first year was good. Or good enough to confuse her. Marcus was building his real estate development company, Mitchell Mercer Capital, and Diana threw her own considerable intelligence entirely behind his ambition. She ran the back-office finances for 2 years without a salary, because we're building something together, this is our future, and she was exceptional at it. She caught 3 contractor billing errors that would have cost him over $400,000. She renegotiated 2 vendor contracts single-handedly when his original lawyer failed to push back on unfavorable terms. She built the financial reporting systems that his first investors relied on to make their decisions. Marcus took the credit. Always. In every room. With every investor. She was my wife, she handles the details. Never, my wife, who saved this company. Never, the woman whose analysis caught what no one else caught. Details. She handled the details. She told herself that didn't matter. That they were a team. That credit was just ego and she was above ego. But here is the foreshadowing, and she missed it completely at the time. When a man erases your contribution in small rooms, with people he doesn't care about, on days when nothing is at stake, watch what he does in the large rooms. Watch what he does when the stakes are real. Watch what he does when claiming you becomes inconvenient. That is not a side of a person. That is the person. She would learn this. She was learning it already, she just didn't have the language for it yet. There was a dinner party, it was in their second year, at the home of one of Marcus's senior investors, where Diana spent 45 minutes explaining, in precise and compelling terms, why a particular development site the investor was skeptical about would outperform his projections. She had the data. She had the research. She had spent 3 days building the case, not because anyone asked her to, but because she saw the opportunity and could not help but map it. The investor listened, asked 2 follow-up questions, and turned to Marcus. That wife of yours knows her numbers, he said. Marcus smiled. She keeps me organized, he said. Diana kept her own smile in place. She picked up her wine glass. She looked at the window. That was the moment, she understood later. Not a dramatic moment. Not a fight or a betrayal or a cruelty bold enough to name. Just a man who had the chance to say her name and chose not to. Just a window she stared at while a piece of her, very quietly, decided it was done pretending that didn't cost anything. But she stayed. She stayed because she believed in the version of him that had loved her. She stayed because they had built things together and she believed things built together meant something. She stayed because leaving felt like failure and she had never once in her entire life walked away from something because it was hard. That stubbornness had saved her many times. In the marriage, for a long time, it only prolonged the damage. The marriage began to curdle around year 3. Marcus had made his first real money by then. The office moved downtown. The house got bigger, a 6-bedroom in Los Feliz with a pool and a housekeeper and a garage that held 2 cars Diana wasn't allowed to drive without asking. And Marcus got colder. He began coming home later. He began looking at Diana the way you look at furniture, present, functional, part of the room's design, but not something you think about. Not something that surprises you. He started making comments. Quiet ones at first. You should do something with your hair before the Andersons' dinner. Maybe the black dress tonight, not that one. You always say the wrong thing at these events, Diana, just smile and let me handle the conversation. She absorbed each one. Told herself he was stressed. Told herself success was changing him temporarily and he would come back to himself. Told herself she was not disappearing, she was just adjusting. But here is what no one tells you about the kind of marriage that erases you slowly. You don't notice the erasure in real time. You only see it in retrospect, when you look back at the woman you were becoming and realize you no longer recognize her. Diana at year 3 of that marriage smiled less than Diana at year 1. Spoke less in rooms full of people. Second-guessed herself more. Apologized for things that were not her fault. And all of it felt normal, because it happened so gradually, one quiet comment at a time, that there was never a single moment she could point to and say, that was the moment something broke. It was 10,000 small moments. And by the time she could count them, she was already somewhere she had never meant to go. And then she got pregnant. She felt something complicated the morning she saw those 2 lines on the test. Joy, real, physical, overwhelming joy, and fear, because she already knew the marriage was cracking and she still hoped, deep in the stubborn place that hope lives, that a baby might remind Marcus of who they had been to each other at the beginning. Might bring him back to himself. Might give them something to build around again. When the doctor said twins, when he turned the screen and showed her 2 small fluttering shadows, 2 heartbeats on the monitor, Diana's hand went to her mouth and her eyes filled and she turned to the chair beside her where Marcus was sitting. He looked at the screen for approximately 5 seconds. Then he looked at his phone. He didn't say a word. She drove herself home. She sat in the driveway for a long time before she went inside. 3 weeks later, she found the divorce filing. The day he told her to leave, because he did tell her eventually, directly, with his attorney on speakerphone and a security deposit check for an apartment he had already chosen for her, Diana did not beg. She did not perform the scene he seemed to be bracing for, the crying, the pleading, the anger. She packed 2 suitcases while he watched from the doorway of their bedroom with an expression she had not seen before. Not cruel exactly. Not guilty either. Just finished. The look of a man who has made a decision and is waiting for the logistics to catch up. She picked up her mother's photograph from the nightstand. She picked up the worn copy of her economics thesis that she had kept on the bedside table for 4 years, she was never sure why, except that it reminded her of who she was before. She walked past Marcus without looking at him. She walked through the house without touching anything that was his. She put the suitcases in her car. She sat in the driveway for 3 minutes. She thought about her mother's hands. Still. Folded. Tight. Then she started the engine and drove away from everything she had tried to build and could not save. The first 3 months were the ones she never talks about publicly. A sublet in a complex with thin walls and a broken heating unit and neighbors who played music until 2 in the morning. A part-time remote bookkeeping job she found at midnight on a Tuesday through a freelance website, the kind of job that paid $18 an hour and required no credentials and asked no questions. Twin daughters born 6 weeks premature, tiny and perfect and terrifying, in a hospital where Diana had listed no emergency contact because there was no one she was willing to call for help yet. Pride is a complicated thing when it is also the only thing keeping you vertical. She learned to do everything at the same time. She worked while they slept. She slept while they napped, 20 minutes at a stretch, with one ear always open. She ate standing over the kitchen counter, quickly, whatever was in reach, because sitting down to a meal felt like a luxury she hadn't earned yet. She rocked 2 babies simultaneously with a technique she developed out of necessity and desperation and love so fierce it was almost indistinguishable from terror. She cried exactly twice. Once, in the hospital, the night after they were born, when the nurse brought both of them to her at the same time and laid them against her chest, and Diana looked down at these 2 small impossible people she had made and sustained entirely alone through the hardest year of her life, and the weight of that fact came over her all at once, and she cried not from sadness but from the sheer size of what she had done and survived. And once, standing in the parking lot of a grocery store at 8:30 in the evening, her card declined for the second time in a week, the girls in the cart in their double car seat insert watching her with their enormous serious eyes, a line forming behind her at the register. She stood there for a moment with nowhere to go and nothing left to pretend with. And a woman behind her in line, a woman she had never seen before, a woman in a green coat with a reusable shopping bag, who had watched the whole thing without pretending not to, quietly stepped forward, handed the cashier a $20 bill, and said to Diana in a voice only she could hear, "I've been there, honey." Diana could not speak. She nodded. The woman nodded back. She did not make it into a moment. She just did what needed to be done, and moved on. Diana thought about that woman every single day for months afterward. The stranger in the green coat who just saw her. Who didn't look away. Who did not perform pity or offer advice or ask what had gone wrong. Who simply recognized something and responded to it like a human being. She made herself a promise in that parking lot. When she was on the other side of this, and she would get to the other side, she told herself that in a specific way that is not a wish but a decision, she was going to be that woman for someone else. Not the one who endured invisibly. The one who saw. She did not know, standing in that parking lot with her $20 bill and her twin daughters and her cracked hands and her cracked heart, that the other side was less than a year away. And that it was going to begin with a phone call she almost didn't answer. The call came on a Thursday afternoon in October, when the girls were 11 months old. Diana was feeding Ava and Grace, sweet potatoes and pureed pears, which Grace accepted with solemn enthusiasm and Ava rejected with a very specific expression of personal offense, an expression that Diana privately thought looked exactly like the face she herself made during difficult client calls. The number that appeared on her phone was not one she recognized. Area code 310. Beverly Hills. She almost let it go. She was elbow-deep in sweet potato puree and running 2 hours behind on a bookkeeping report and had not yet had lunch. She almost set the phone face down and called back in an hour. She picked it up. The voice on the other end was male. Measured. Not warm exactly, but not unkind, the voice of a man accustomed to delivering information precisely and trusting the receiver to handle it. He said his name was Elliot Reeves. He said he was calling on behalf of a client who had been following her work. She almost laughed. She was a freelance bookkeeper in a 2-bedroom apartment feeding pureed sweet potatoes to 11-month-old twins. What work was there to follow? But she didn't say it. Because something else was happening. Something she had not felt in a very long time, a pull of attention. A sharpening. The specific feeling her professor used to call her hunting instinct. The sense that something real was on the other end of a thread worth pulling, and that the only mistake she could make right now was to set the phone down. She asked Elliot Reeves to tell her more. What he described took 14 minutes. A private equity firm. A complex real estate acquisition. A portfolio of distressed properties across 3 western states with tangled financial histories that 2 previous analysts had failed to make sense of. The firm's founder wanted someone with a specific combination of skills, deep forensic financial capability, knowledge of real estate structures, and the particular kind of patience that could sit with a puzzle long enough to understand it rather than forcing a premature solution. The founder had found a brief article in a regional business journal about 3 contractor billing errors caught at a mid-sized Los Angeles development firm 2 years prior. The article had quoted an anonymous source close to the company, Marcus's CFO, as it turned out, a man who had possessed more integrity than his employer and had found Diana's analysis and could not quite bring himself not to mention it to someone when a reporter came asking about the firm's early growth. The article had described the analyst only as a financial consultant working closely with the company's leadership. The firm's founder had clipped it. Filed it away. And when the right moment came, when he needed someone who could do what that unnamed analyst had done, he had pulled it out. That founder was James Harrington. And while Diana did not fully know that name yet, the name Harrington Capital meant something even to someone who had been surviving on freelance bookkeeping rates for 11 months. She asked Elliot Reeves to give her 48 hours. Of course, he said. She hung up. She sat very still for a moment. The twins watched her from their high chairs with the focused, solemn attention of very small people who understand nothing and feel everything. Then she got up, cleaned them both with the efficiency of long practice, carried them to the living room, turned on the playlist of soft music they napped to, got them settled, came back to the kitchen, and sat down at the table with a legal pad and a pencil. She worked for 4 hours straight. She broke the proposal apart piece by piece. She looked for the places where the offer was better than it appeared and the places where it might be worse. She ran the compensation numbers 3 different ways. She mapped out what a 3-month contract at that rate would mean for her, month by month, in concrete terms, and then what it would mean if it extended. She wrote every question she had, and then she wrote the answers she already knew, and then she wrote the new questions those answers raised. She filled 6 pages of the legal pad with small, precise handwriting. At 11:30 that night, when both girls were asleep and the apartment was quiet and the legal pad was full, she called her mother. "Mama. I need to tell you something." "I'm listening, baby." "Something is happening. Something real." Carol Mercer had worked 2 jobs and raised 2 children and said nothing out loud about a prenuptial agreement she didn't trust. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "How real?" "Real enough that I'm scared." "Good," her mother said. "That means it matters. You've been surviving, baby. Surviving is not the same as living. I have been waiting for you to find the door out of surviving. Don't you dare walk past it because you're scared." Diana held the phone against her ear and looked out her window at the city. The lights of Los Angeles were spread below her, indifferent and enormous and full of people, most of them struggling with something, some of them about to change their own story and not yet knowing it. She called Elliot Reeves back in 32 hours. She said yes. That was 11 months ago. If you're still feeling this, comment "I'm still here." Because what happened in those 11 months is the part of this story that Marcus Mercer never knew about. The part that was growing quietly, steadily, with the particular patience of something that does not need to announce itself, while he was planning a wedding and mailing gold envelopes and congratulating himself on his upgrade and imagining Diana still eating cereal for dinner in a sublet with broken heat and no prospects. He was not paying attention. That was his first mistake and his last. The 3-month contract became 6. 6 became permanent. Diana's title, Senior Forensic Analyst, Harrington Capital, meant nothing to anyone at a cocktail party, but inside the firm, and increasingly in the careful circles that Harrington operated in, it meant everything. She was the one who found what wasn't supposed to be findable. She had a gift for reading financial structures the way other people read faces, picking up the small inconsistencies, the slight hesitations in the numbers, the tells of a figure that had been coached but not quite coached enough. She understood that money lies the same way people lie, not by saying something entirely false, but by omitting the one true thing that changes everything. She was extraordinary at this. She had always been extraordinary at this. It just hadn't been given a room to live in before. James Harrington noticed. He was a quiet man, 71 years old, white-haired, with a face that had been weathered by 4 decades of watching people make decisions and living with the consequences of his own. The kind of wealthy that has nothing left to prove and therefore no reason to perform. He called her into his office 8 weeks into the contract, closed the door, and said 4 words that changed Diana's understanding of her own future. "You see what's real. Not, good work. Not, impressive analysis. Not the things people say to smart employees they want to retain." He said, "You see what's real." And Diana understood that he was not talking only about financial documents. She moved the girls into a real apartment. Sunlight in every room. A 2nd bedroom with space enough to breathe. She hired a part-time nanny, a warm woman named Petra who sang to the girls and taught them Spanish words and made Diana's kitchen smell like something wonderful every single evening. Diana bought herself one good coat. A real one. Not second-hand. She wore it the first morning and stood in front of the mirror for a long time looking at the woman in it. She was not, by any reasonable definition, rich yet. But she was building something with her own hands. Something Marcus had no claim on. Something that existed because of who she was, not despite who she had survived being. And every day she went to work and did extraordinary things and came home to 2 little girls who called her mommy and grabbed her knees and showed her their drawings and needed her completely. Every one of those days was a brick. And then the gold envelope arrived. She read it on a Tuesday morning. She set it on the table. She sat with it for a while, for the full weight of its cruelty, for the full measure of what it intended, and then she called James Harrington. James listened without interrupting. When she finished, there was a pause of perhaps 3 seconds. Then he said, "What do you want to do?" She told him. Another pause. Then, "I'll make some calls." "You don't have to. Diana." His voice was gentle but final. "I know exactly what kind of man this is. I watched him do what he did to his previous business partner before you ever came to us. That case is in civil litigation as of last month. I have been patient, because rushing these things destroys them. But your invitation may be the moment. He stopped. Then, but only if you are certain. This is your life, not mine. I will not push you towards something you are not ready for. She thought about the gold envelope. The 4 handwritten words, I thought of you. She thought about Ava and Grace sleeping in their room with the moon nightlight, 3 years old, no idea that their father had built a life without a single square inch of space for them. She thought about her mother's still, tight hands. I'm certain, Diana said. And that's when everything changed. Now here is the part Marcus had absolutely no way of anticipating, the detail that transforms his cruel little trap into his own undoing. Marcus Mercer understood power as a wall. He believed that wealth was a fortress, and that anyone without it was on the outside, pressing their face to the glass, wanting what he had. He believed that by leaving Diana with nothing, he had ensured she would stay nothing. That the distance between where he was and where she was could only grow with time. What he had never understood, what no one had ever taught him, because he had never cared to learn it, is that real power is not a wall. It is not a fortress. It is a network. A web of trust built slowly, over years, through keeping your word and seeing people clearly and doing the right thing when it would have been easier not to. And Diana Mercer, in 11 months of doing extraordinary work for a man who had spent 40 years building exactly that kind of network, had quietly and completely become part of it. Because James Harrington did not just make real estate deals. He sat on 3 nonprofit boards with people who ran state-level financial oversight bodies. He had co-invested, over decades, with federal regulatory commissioners who remembered when Harrington had done the right thing by them. He had donated to attorney general campaigns in 2 states, not for access, but because he agreed with their platforms, which those attorneys general remembered when it mattered. He had spent 40 years accumulating the kind of goodwill that exists almost invisibly, that produces almost no visible return for almost all of its life, and then, occasionally, when the right moment arrives, it produces everything at once. He called it in. The details he did not share with Diana entirely. He told her what she needed to know: come to the wedding. Arrive as the woman you are, not the woman he believes you became. And bring your daughters. Is it safe? She asked. For you, he said, absolutely. For him, well. That depends on what the truth looks like when it's finally in the right light. Diana closed her eyes. She thought about the grocery store parking lot. The woman in the green coat. She thought about her mother's hands. She thought about Ava asking, with 3-year-old gravity, what the moon was made of, and Diana not knowing the answer but looking it up and reading it to her by lamplight because there was nothing in the world Ava asked that did not deserve an answer. She opened her eyes. All right, she said. Let's go to a wedding. The day of Marcus Mercer's wedding to Camille Ashford began the way important days often do, quietly, unremarkably, with the smell of coffee and the sound of 2 3-year-olds arguing about whether the stuffed elephant or the stuffed rabbit had the right to sit in the good chair at breakfast. Diana sat at her kitchen table in her robe. She had slept 4 hours. Not from anxiety exactly, but from the particular hyper-awareness that comes when your body understands that something large is about to happen and refuses to waste the moment on unconsciousness. She had lain in bed for 2 hours before dawn, listening to the city, thinking about nothing specific, letting her mind do what it did before major work, go still and clear, like water before a stone hits it. Petra arrived at 7:15, took one look at Diana's face, and silently handed her a second cup of coffee without a word. Petra was extraordinary in this way. She understood the difference between a morning when you needed to talk and a morning when you needed to be left alone inside your own preparation. At 9:15, a car arrived. Not just a car. The car was a silver Rolls-Royce Ghost, and the neighbors noticed. Of course they noticed. It was long and quiet as a held breath, its finish catching the morning light in the way that only things made with genuine care catch light, and a driver in a dark suit opened the rear door without being asked. Behind it idled a black SUV carrying a stylist, 2 racks of clothing in garment bags, and a professional makeup case. Mrs. Park from across the hall stopped on her way to the elevator with her morning grocery bag and stood with her mouth open, her eyes moving between Diana in her doorway and the car at the curb and back to Diana. Going somewhere nice? Mrs. Park said finally. Just a wedding, Diana said. Inside the car, the stylist, a calm and extraordinarily efficient woman named Rosario who had dressed half of downtown Los Angeles for events Diana could not have afforded to attend a year ago, laid 3 options across the seat. Diana touched the first one. The second. The third. She chose a dress the color of champagne. Not gold, she was not there to compete with gold. Not white, that was not her statement to make today. Champagne. Something older. Warmer. Something that said it had already been through things and come out beautiful. Something that looked like it did not need to try. Rosario worked in the back of the moving car with the practiced ease of a surgeon, foundation, contour, the careful architecture of confidence made visible. Ava and Grace sat in their car seats watching this process with the absolute fascination of small people witnessing something extraordinary. Grace reached out twice to help, and Rosario incorporated her somehow without losing the line she was drawing. "What does mommy look like?" Diana asked them when Rosario stepped back. Grace considered the question with enormous seriousness, tilting her head slightly to the left the way she did when something required real thought. "Like the princess at the end," Grace said. "Not the beginning." Diana did not cry. She had made herself that rule that morning. No tears until after. She could feel everything she needed to feel, the grief, the anger, the long-compressed grief of 4 years of a marriage that unmade her and 11 months of making herself back, and the strange solemn joy of arriving at a day she had earned in ways no one who had not lived it could understand. She could feel all of it. But not yet. Not yet. "Good," she said. "That's exactly right." The Beverly Hills Grand had been designed to make people feel smaller than they were. That was not an accident. The ceilings were deliberately too high. The chandeliers were too bright. The marble floors were too wide and too reflective, so that every person who entered could see themselves entering, could see the gap between what they were and what the room was, and adjust accordingly. Rich people loved it for exactly this reason. It gave them a stage. It made the comparison they wanted to make easier to make. Marcus loved it. He had chosen it from a short list of 7 venues, and he had chosen it specifically for this quality. He wanted the grandeur to work for him. He wanted 230 guests to walk in and feel the scale of what he had built, and he wanted, at the center of it all, to watch one particular woman walk through those doors and feel how far she had fallen from the world he now inhabited. He had been watching the door for 40 minutes when the Rolls-Royce pulled up. He saw it through the tall windows near the entrance. Saw the gleam of silver. Saw the flash of cameras from the Lifestyle magazine's hired photographer who had set up outside to catch arriving guests. Saw the driver step out and open the door with the unhurried precision of a man paid to do one thing and do it exactly right. And then he saw Diana step out. There is no adequate way to describe the specific experience of a man who has built a moment around the anticipation of someone's defeat, who has rehearsed the scene in his head in exact detail, the shabby dress, the pinched anxious face, the faltering step, the look of a woman who has lost, and instead receives the sight of a woman who looks like she has already won. Diana stepped out of that car in champagne silk, her hair up, her shoulders back, her eyes forward. Not performing anything. Not trying. Simply arriving, the way she had arrived at everything in her life that mattered, with full attention and without apology. Beside her, Ava and Grace in ivory dresses with ribbon sashes, their curls pinned back, holding their mothers' hands on either side and looking up at the hotel with the wide, unafraid attention of children who have only ever seen their mother walk into difficult rooms without flinching and have therefore never learned to flinch either. And behind them, stepping from the front passenger door, was James Harrington. 71 years old. White-haired. Navy suit. He moved with the unhurried authority of a man who has been in every kind of room and knows that the room does not make the person makes the room. He did not look at the cameras. He looked at Diana, offered his arm, and waited. She took it. The murmurs started at the edges of the crowd and moved inward the way murmurs always do in rooms full of people who are paying close attention to status. Is that Harrington? James Harrington? Here. Wait, who is that with him? That's Marcus's ex-wife. And then, a beat later, as the pieces assembled themselves into the picture they made. Those are his daughters. Those are Marcus's children. Inside, at the center of the ballroom, Marcus's smile was doing something it had not done in a very long time, something involuntary. Something he could not control. The smile of a man who realizes, mid-sentence, that the joke he is telling does not have the ending he wrote for it. Marcus moved. He moved because standing still felt like admission, and Marcus Mercer had not admitted a single thing in his life that he could avoid admitting. He crossed the floor with his chin up, arms open, the smile reinstalled, performing the version of himself that had gotten him through 100 rooms full of people who wanted something from him. "Diana," he said. His voice carrying beautifully. Warm enough to suggest generosity. Tight enough that she could hear the warning underneath. "You actually came. I'm touched." Diana looked at him. She did not look at him like a woman gathering herself to speak. She looked at him the way she looked at documents, reading for the true thing beneath the presented thing, patient, unhurried. And she let the silence work. 3 full seconds. Then, "Hello, Marcus. You look exactly the same." It was not an insult. It was not a compliment. It was a statement of fact from a woman who had spent 11 months professionally identifying what had not changed when everything else had, and who recognized in him the same things she had always seen now that she was no longer inside them. "And who is this?" Marcus said, turning to Harrington, and the tone he used was the tone of a man reaching for dismissal and finding only question. James Harrington extended a hand. "James Harrington. Harrington Capital. Diana has been with our firm for nearly a year. She is one of the most exceptional analysts I have had in 40 years of doing this work." He paused just long enough. "I imagine you already knew that, Mr. Mercer. She did the same quality of work for you before she came to us. It's unfortunate you didn't recognize it at the time. A great deal of what has followed might have gone differently." The silence that followed lasted 5 seconds. Somewhere across the room, Gordon Fitch, $11 million invested, not sleeping well about it, was reading something on his phone. His expression shifted. He put the phone in his pocket. He exchanged a look with the man beside him. Then he walked toward the exit. Marcus watched him go. He knew that walk. "Diana," Marcus said, and his voice had lost its warmth entirely, "whatever you're doing, whatever he has put you up to, this is my wedding. These are my guests. Whatever grievance you think you have." Diana looked at him with great calm. "You sent me an invitation, Marcus." She reached into her small clutch. She removed a folded document. She did not hand it to him, she set it on the nearest surface, a table laid with wedding favors in gold boxes. "That's a copy of the filing with the State Financial Regulatory Authority. It was submitted this morning. It's public record." She paused. An embargoed copy was sent to 3 financial reporters. The embargo lifts at 2 o'clock. She looked at her watch. "It's 1:53. Marcus's face went through several things in rapid sequence. Disbelief. Calculation. Fear. Fury. And underneath all of them, the particular hollow look of a man who has run a very long bluff and just heard someone call it. That's when everything changed. What the 230 wedding guests witnessed in the next 15 minutes was not a wedding. It was a reckoning conducted with extraordinary precision by a woman who had spent 11 months preparing for it without ever losing sight of why she was doing it. Diana did not shout. She did not cry. She stood in the center of that room in champagne silk with her 2 daughters holding her hands, and she spoke in the measured, clear voice of someone who has already done the work and needs only to present it. She spoke about the 4 years she had worked without pay or credit to build a company that bore a name that was not hers. She spoke about the contractor errors she had caught, the contracts she had negotiated, the reporting systems she had built. She spoke about the morning she had found the divorce filing on a shared computer when she was 7 months pregnant. She spoke about the sublet with thin walls and the part-time bookkeeping jobs and the hospital where she had listed no emergency contact. She did not perform grief. She did not ask for sympathy. She stated facts. She stated them the way she stated every finding in every financial document she had ever analyzed, with precision, without embellishment, with the understanding that the facts themselves were enough. Camille Ashford, who had been standing near the head table gripping her champagne flute with increasing force, was watching Marcus. Not with love or even loyalty, those ships had sailed the moment Gordon Fitch walked toward the exit with his phone in his hand, but with the calculating attention of a woman assessing an investment that was losing value in real time. She handed Marcus back the engagement ring at 1:57. She did it quietly. Almost gently. She set it directly in his palm, looked at him for one long moment, and then turned and walked out through the ballroom side doors with her chin up and her gown sweeping behind her and the Lifestyle magazine's photographer catching every step. Marcus stood with the ring in his palm. And then Ava, who was 3 years old, who had been holding her mother's hand and watching everything with the solemn focused attention of a child who understands nothing and therefore fears nothing, looked up at the man standing there. She looked at him for a long time. Then she turned to Grace and whispered something. Grace nodded with great seriousness. Ava looked back up at Marcus Mercer and said, "You look sad." The room broke. Not into laughter. Not into mockery. Into the specific kind of silence that falls when something completely true has been said by someone who had no reason to say anything but the truth. At 2:04, 3 men in suits arrived through the main entrance of the Beverly Hills Grand Hotel. One was an attorney. 2 were regulatory investigators. The filing that Diana had submitted that morning, the forensic analysis of 8 months of fund misallocation within Mitchell Mercer Capital's current development project, had triggered an expedited review. The kind of review that happens when the documentation is too clean and too complete to wait. They had not rushed. They had not needed to rush. Diana had given them everything they needed weeks ago. Today was simply the day the clock ran out. Marcus saw them from across the room. He recognized the particular quality of their arrival, not the arrival of guests, not the arrival of vendors or press, but the arrival of men who have a specific purpose and know exactly what it is. He had seen that quality of arrival before, in his career, when it happened to other people. He had watched it from a comfortable distance and felt the particular privately satisfying feeling of a man who believed that kind of arrival would never come for him, because he was careful, because he was smart, because he had covered his tracks well enough. He had not accounted for Diana. He turned to the room. He looked at his investors, his business partners, the friends he had assembled to witness this night. He looked at 200 people who had come to see him crowned. He looked at them looking at him, and he did not find what he needed. No one moved toward him. No one opened their mouth to speak in his defense. The people who had toasted him an hour ago were studying the floor, their phones, the middle distance, anywhere except his face. The oldest and most reliable truth in business, a man surrounded by people who want something from him has no real allies. He has only a temporary arrangement. The moment that arrangement becomes more costly than beneficial, it dissolves. Marcus had always known this intellectually, the way people know things they have never fully applied to themselves. And Diana, watching from across the room with her daughter's hands in hers, understood something she had not quite understood before. She had come here to place the truth in the right light. She had done that. And the truth, once in the right light, did not need her anymore. It was self-sustaining now. It would run without her. She was finished. She had done her job completely. She looked down at Ava. Then at Grace. Both of them looking back up at her. "Can we go get something to eat?" Ava asked. Diana laughed. It surprised her, the realness of it, the fullness of it. She laughed for the first time in a long time in a room full of people without wondering how it looked. "Yes," she said. "We can absolutely go get something to eat. Let's go." The room had been bracing for collapse for the better part of an hour. You could feel it the way you feel a storm before it arrives, a shift in pressure, a collective held breath, the sense that everything that has been suspended at great cost is about to come down. When it came in a series of quick, quiet pieces. The investigators at the entrance. The attorney with the folder. Gordon Fitch already gone. Camille Ashford already gone. The investors who had once toasted Marcus's success now looking at their watches and calculating the cost of association. Marcus tried, at the end, to control the room. He raised his voice. He pointed fingers. He performed righteous indignation in the way that men who have built their entire architecture on performance perform it even when the performance has completely failed, not because they think it will work, but because they have never, not once in their adult lives, tried anything else. He called it a setup. He called Diana bitter. He used the word vindictive. He used the word jealous. The room watched him with the quiet, collective judgment of people who have been told one story for years and have just heard a different one and can feel, bone deep, which version is true. The investigators reached him just before 2:15. They were professional and unhurried and very calm. Marcus did not go quietly, he never went quietly at anything, but his noise was the noise of a man who has already lost and has not yet fully processed it. A performance for an audience that had already left. And Ava and Grace stood beside their mother and watched it all with the enormous serious eyes of children who are old enough to know that something important is happening and young enough to believe, without question, that their mother has it handled. That was the expected twist. The villain falls. The evidence is irrefutable. The room turns. The architecture of lies collapses at the weight of a truth too long deferred. But that is not the real twist. The real twist is what changes everything you think you just witnessed. Here is what almost no one in that room understood. Marcus Mercer had believed, with complete confidence, that the worst thing Diana could do to him was show up. That this was a war of appearances, his new life versus her supposed ruin, and that she had simply arrived better dressed than expected. He had believed the invitation was the weapon, and that she was there to wield it back at him. He had believed this was personal. He was wrong. Diana Mercer was not there for Marcus. She was there for the investors. For Gordon Fitch. For the three others. For the regulatory investigators who needed the documentation presented in the right context at the right moment by a witness with standing. She was there because James Harrington had told her, 6 weeks before the wedding, that the paper filing alone, as complete and airtight as it was, might not move fast enough. That Marcus had the right lawyers and had done this kind of thing before, and that the machine of legal defense, given time and distance, could manage almost anything. What it could not manage, Harrington had said, was 200 witnesses. What it could not manage was the investors in the same room with the documentation and the man simultaneously, with no time to receive managed messaging before they saw the truth for themselves. What it could not manage was the personal testimony of the woman who had built his first company for free and been erased from its history. What it could not manage was a child's face. Diana was there as a forensic analyst completing an assignment. The most personal assignment she would ever take, yes. The one with the most at stake, absolutely. But an assignment conducted with the same precision and care and patient intelligence she brought to every case. She had not arrived to break Marcus. He had already broken himself, had been breaking himself for years, one misallocated fund, one erased contribution, one abandoned daughter at a time. She had arrived to make sure the breaking happened where the right people could see it and could not later pretend they hadn't. She had arrived, as she always had, to see what was real. And to make sure that what was real was, finally, in the light. But here is the second layer. The thing that changes the story at its root. When Diana had told Harrington about the invitation, when she had shown him the gold envelope with the handwritten note, for words on the back, James Harrington had gone still for a long moment in his quiet way. And then he had said, "He's given us the room." Diana had not understood at first. "He is gathering every person we need," Harrington said. "In one place. At one moment. On his stage, with his name on the invitations. He is handing us the venue and the audience and the occasion. He thinks he is staging your humiliation. He is actually staging his own exposure. And he is doing it because cruelty always overreaches." Diana had looked at the invitation in her hand for a long time after that. Marcus Mercer had sent her that envelope because he wanted to see her suffer in public. Because his cruelty had always required an audience. Because he had never, not once, done a cruel thing quietly and alone, he had always needed witnesses, always needed the performance, always needed to see the effect. That need, the same need that had driven him for 30 years, had become the mechanism of his undoing. He had handed her the room. He had handed her the stage. He had mailed her the invitation personally. And she had arrived. The months that followed were not a fairy tale. Let's be honest about that, because the women who need this story most are the ones who know that real things are not fairy tales, and they deserve the truth. Marcus hired 3 attorneys. The regulatory process moved the way all institutional processes move, with the grinding, impersonal patience of machinery that is not designed for human emotion. There were delays. There were motions. There were counternarratives and procedural challenges and the specific frustration of watching the right thing take time. Diana sat in depositions. She submitted documentation. She answered questions from people who were sometimes respectful and sometimes not, who sometimes understood what they were looking at and sometimes needed it explained slowly, twice. She kept working through all of it. She kept coming home. She kept making dinner. She had learned to cook real meals somewhere in the 2nd year, not because she had to but because she found that she wanted to, wanted the ritual of it, the way it filled the kitchen with warmth and made the girls appear at her elbow asking what it was going to be. And she kept reading bedtime stories and checking on Ava and Grace at 11 in the evening when she couldn't sleep and needed to stand in their doorway and watch them breathing. That was her anchor. Not the case. Not the career. Not the testimony she would give that would eventually be cited in the settlement documents. The sound of 2 children sleeping. The civil litigation settlement came first, 14 months after the wedding. Marcus agreed to restitution to his former business partner. He agreed to restitution to the 3 investors who had withdrawn. The terms were sealed, but the outcome was public. Mitchell Mercer Capital ceased operations. Marcus sold his remaining assets. He moved back to his hometown in Ohio. He did not, at any point in any of this, reach out to Diana. He did not reach out to his daughters. Diana found, to her own quiet surprise, that she had stopped expecting him to. The absence, which had once been a wound she pressed on constantly, not because pressing it helped but because she kept hoping it would eventually stop hurting when she pressed it, had become simply a fact. A thing that was true about the girls' lives. A thing she was building around honestly, with care, without pretending it didn't exist. She told them, when they were old enough to ask, "Your father made choices I could not change and you could not change. But you have never, not for one single day, not for one single minute, been anything other than completely wanted." Ava looked at her with the same still, focused intensity she had brought to every important thing since she was old enough to form expressions. "By you," Ava said. "We've always been wanted by you." "Yes," Diana said. "Always by me. There was a cost. There is always a cost. The cost was time, the slow wait of process, the years of it. The cost was the particular loneliness of doing the right thing when right is long and complicated and doesn't arrive with music. The cost was carrying the future of 2 small people through a world that had not been designed to make space for them, through rooms that did not expect them, into a life that Diana had to insist on rather than inherit. But here is what grew in the space the cost made. Here is what she built in the room the cost cleared. She launched a program. Through Harrington Capital's foundation, a fund for single mothers in acute financial crisis, women who had skills, who had done extraordinary things, who were between the bottom and the door and needed 6 months of bridge income and a network and someone who saw them clearly enough to say, "This is not the end of your story." In its first year, the program helped 31 women. Diana visited each of them. Not as a benefactor, not as an executive, but as the woman in the green coat, the one who had shown up, seen something true, and done what needed doing without making a production of it. She sat with them the way she had sat with women at the shelter years ago, before Marcus, before the marriage unmade her temporarily. She said, "I believe you," and meant it. She said, "I see what you are capable of," and pointed to the specific things, this analysis you ran, this negotiation you led, this problem you solved at 2 in the morning with no support and no framework and 2 children sick in the next room. She named it. She said it out loud, in rooms full of people, on days when something was at stake. She did for them what no one had done for her in the years when she needed it most. And she found, doing this, that the grief she had carried, the grief of the erased years, the silent credit, the marriage that had slowly told her she was less than she was, that grief did not disappear. But it changed shape. It became something she could carry differently. Not as a wound she pressed on, but as a map. Here is where I went. Here is what it cost. Here is what I found at the bottom. Here is the door that was always there, that I finally walked through. She could not give back the years Marcus had taken. She understood that now, fully, without bitterness, the way you understand things that are simply true. She could not unmake what had been made. But she could make something else. Something entirely hers. Something that would outlast every piece of the story Marcus had tried to write for her. He sat in the back row, his preference always was the back row, and said nothing during the speeches. But afterward, when Diana found him near the exit putting on his coat, he stopped and looked at her. "Your professor was right about you," he said. Diana looked at him. "Mrs. Graves?" "I tracked her down," he said. "I do that with the people I hire. I wanted to understand who you were before the parts one could see. She told me you were going to go somewhere no one in your family had been, and that she hoped no one talked you out of it." He paused. His voice had something in it she had not heard before, not sentiment exactly, but something adjacent to it. The specific weight that accumulates in a person who has lived long enough to see patterns complete themselves. "No one did," he said. He put on his coat. "You should be proud of that. It matters more than the case. It matters more than the settlement. That you got here by being who you are and not by becoming something else." He nodded once. Then he walked out into the night. Diana stood in the doorway with the sound of 31 women and their children behind her, the sound of people at the beginning of something, which is the best sound there is, and she thought about a girl on a school bus in Beaumont, Texas, reading with a library card in her pocket. She thought about her mother's hands. Still. Tight. She thought about two little girls in ivory dresses with ribbon sashes who called her the princess at the end, not the beginning. She thought about a woman in a green coat in a grocery store parking lot who handed a stranger a $20 bill and did not make a moment of it. She stood very still and let all of it be real at the same time. And that was when she realized, the truth hadn't just changed her life. It had revealed who she had always been. And who she had always been was enough. Had always been enough. Had always been more than enough. She had simply been waiting for the right room to say so out loud. You are still here. If you've stayed with Diana through every one of those moments, the parking lot, the legal pad at midnight, the gold envelope, the champagne dress, the ballroom, the doorway with the sound of 31 families behind her, then something in this story found the part of you that knows what it means to survive something that was supposed to finish you. So I want to ask you something, and I want you to really sit with it before you answer. When Diana received that gold envelope, when she unfolded it and read those 4 handwritten words, I thought of you, what would you have done? Would you have thrown it in the trash? Stayed home, stayed safe, stayed invisible in the way that people who have been hurt enough times learn to stay invisible? Or would you have done what she did, looked at that invitation and seen in it not a trap, but a door? There is no wrong answer. But the way you answer it tells you something about where you are right now. About whether you are still in the parking lot, still in the moment of the declined card, the thin walls, the exhaustion that goes all the way down, or whether you are already moving, even slowly, even one day at a time, toward the doorway. Here is the question that divides people every time this story is told. I want to see it in the comments. I want the debate, because the debate is worth having. Did Marcus deserve what happened to him? Or did he deserve something else? Because some people watch that ballroom scene and say, yes. Justice. He built an empire on stolen money and erased credit and abandoned children. He tried to use a woman's pain as a prop for his pride. The consequence was right, it was earned, and it was 14 months late. The regulatory filing, the investors walking out, the ring returned and dropped on the marble floor, all of it was the exact architecture of what he had built finally falling on the person who built it. And there are others, and I hear them, I truly hear them, who say that a man who was never taught to see other people, who spent his whole life treating love like a ledger and people like assets, who never once looked at a woman doing extraordinary work and said her name out loud, that man was not evil. He was hollow. And hollow things don't need punishment. They need something they cannot receive, genuine consequence that reaches inside the hollow place and fills it with something true. And maybe the truest consequence in that entire room was not the regulatory investigators. It was a 3-year-old girl looking up at her father and saying, simply and without malice, you look sad. Which moment hit you hardest? Was it Diana's mother at the wedding, the still, tight hands? Was it the parking lot? Was it Ava's voice in that silence? Was it James Harrington saying, 8 weeks into a contract, you see what's real? Tell me. Leave it in the comments. I read them, I read all of them. Every single one. Because I want to tell you something about why we come to stories like this one. Why we sit with them for an hour and let them in past the part of us that is too busy or too tired or too guarded to be moved. It isn't for the drama. It isn't for the takedown or the triumph. It is because somewhere in every story like Diana's, there is a moment that is not her moment. It is ours. A moment where the story holds up something reflective, and we see ourselves in it, not our best version or our worst version, but our truest version. The part of us that knows what it costs to keep going when keeping going feels impossible. Maybe your moment was when Diana almost didn't answer the phone. Maybe it was when she made herself the rule, no tears until after. Maybe it was the simplest thing, a woman in a green coat who saw someone struggling and did not look away. Wherever your moment was, carry it. That is what these stories are for. Not to entertain, though they do that too. But to remind us, in the places where we are most tired and most tempted to give up, that the woman in the parking lot becomes the woman in the doorway. Always. One more thing. You may be wondering about the woman in the green coat. The stranger with the $20 bill who handed it over without making a production of it and walked away. Diana thought about her every single day for the better part of a year. She never found out who she was. But that woman? She has a story of her own. And it is coming. Soon. And you will not want to miss it. If you haven't subscribed yet, now is the time. Hit that button. Ring the bell. Leave me one word in the comments, just one, that describes how Diana's story made you feel. One word. I will read every single one, and I will carry them. Thank you for being here. Thank you for staying with this story all the way to the end, through every room it took you into. That matters. You matter. And remember, you are stronger than the storm that is trying to break you. The woman in the parking lot becomes the woman in the doorway. Not all at once. Not without cost. But always. Until next time.